Chumash Shemois. Chumash Shemois defined by the Ramban as Sefer HaGolos v'HaGeula. It is the Sefer of exile and redemption. And usually when I start Chumash Shemois, I make a comment. HBrachos is all about individuals, the giants of yore. Starting with Odom HaRishon HaNoach. They were the general tzaddikim before Klal Yisrael, before Israel was born. And then we go over to the Ovis Hekdoshim, Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, and that is when our story begins. Our story begins on Parshas Lech Lecha. And the climax and culmination of the Sefer is Yaakov Avinu and his 12 sons, and Yaakov benches his 12 children. So it is the story about individuals. Chumash Shemois is the story of a people. We were transformed from individuals to a nation in Chumash Shemois. In Golos Mitzrayim, the Pasuk says, Lekach az goy mikerev goy. And then, the ultimate stage of becoming a people is Mamad Har Sinai, when we all stood at the foot of Mount Sinai of Har Sinai, Begdimunas al Nishma. So the topic we will be discussing today is not a very lamdish topic, but I think the beauty of our shir is the variety of different sugyas and different styles. So the shir today is not a very lamdish shir like the ones we had in the past few weeks, but it is an extremely important shir for Jews and from Jews in the world over. Is it legitimate to use non-Jewish names? So, my most dear friend, Chaim Malinsky, is sitting at my right. Many people listening to the Shia know him as Henry. Since day number one, Chaim made it clear to me, between me and you, I'm Chaim, and to me, he's Chaim. I know some amazing people, primarily my good friends in Chutz La'aretz, that use non-Jewish names. I know a Ralph and a Brian, and to me, they're Baruch and Raphael. So the topic we discuss today is Shaloshinu Shemam. And the posuk is the very first posuk in Chumash Shemois. Ve'ele Shemois b'nei Yisrael aboa Mitzrayim, or Eis Yankov Ishu Beisabo. The Balaturim writes, B'nei Shemois b'nei Yisrael haboim Rosh HaTevis Shivyo. And the remez is, even when we were shivuim, we were trapped, we were servants and slaves, Rosh HaTevis Shivyo, Ele Shemois b'nei Yisrael, Reuven, Shimon, Levi, Yehuda, Lo Shinu es Shemam. And the Balaturim quotes the Medrash, B'schus shloishe devorim nig'alu aviseinu me'Mitzrayim, shelo shinu es Shemam, es levusham ve'es lushonam. They kept their own identity, they kept their names, they kept their tongue, and they kept their dress. And that is why there was Zeicha to go Ulas Mitzrayim. So we will be discussing today, is it a prohibition to use non-Jewish names? So, Chuvas Maram Shik, Yoredei Semakuf Samachtes, writes it's an Issa Diuraisa, and he's very, very machmir. Following in the footsteps of the Maram Shik, we find his great Talmud, Shar Shuvas Marshag, Reb Shimon Greenfeld, the Rav of Semihai in Hungary, a Talmud of the Maram Shik, Chelik Beis Makuf Tzadik Daled, following in his footsteps, the Tzafnes Paneach, the Rogachover, in his Shuvas Imereisha Ein Hai. You cannot use non-Jewish names. However, the Rogachover has an interesting comment, and he says, a non-Jewish translation of a Jewish name is legitimate. So exactly how do we define translations? So this week a person came to me with a sefer, Choshev sefer, and he asked for a skoma. And what's your name? His name is Michael, a Talmud Chochem, asking for a skoma. And he tells me that he's, he visits Williamsburg a lot, and he interacts with Satmar Hasidim, and they think it's a real Yiddish name, Michael, Yankel. Same sound, Yankel, Michael. Some people confuse him with Yankel. So Michael, according to the Tzafnas B'nech, would be legitimate because it is Michael. Would Henry be a translation of Chaim? I don't know. It's not the same. Michael is Michael. Would Brian be a translation of Borech? I don't think so. Who knows? Would Morris be a translation of Moshe? In this week's parsha, we're talking about Moshe Rabbeinu. It's difficult to define. But as I quoted, some Gedolim say it is Mamish Inisa Diuraisa Bechu Koiseyem Lo Teilecho. Chuvas Marsham Chelek Vav Siman Yud. That's a fascinating tshuva. So the Maram Shik argues, it is an Isa Bechu Koiseyem Lo Teilecho Va'avdil Eschem Minhu Amim. The Marsham has a different approach, a very interesting, a fascinating one. So the Marsham doesn't deal directly with the Shaila. Could a Jew use an un-Jewish name? He talks about a story. A woman donated a mantle for a Sefer Torah, a me'il of a Sefer Torah, and she wrote the posuk V'yato kis v'lachem es hashiru azois, like the minig is, some beautiful psukim from Torah's Moshe, but the dedication she wrote a non-Jewish name in Latin letters. And the Masham was asked, is that legitimate to have a Sefer Torah on which the inscription is not a Jewish name and not Jewish letters? And the Masham comes up with a eitzah, with a device which I don't think would make anyone happy. Not that those are pro or those that are against. And he says there should be like a cover, like a flap, with a Jewish name to cover the non-Jewish name, and it should only be sewn to the me'il on top. That means you could lift it and see the original inscription, or drop it and see the Hebrew inscription. And why is that? So the Masham writes, anybody that uses non-Jewish names is an Aveda. What is the origin of this Aveda? And he comes up with an interesting svara. If Chazal say, we were zoichet to Geulas Mitzrayim because lo yishinu shemam, that means anybody using a non-Jewish name is ma'akev the Geula. If keeping your Jewish name hastens the Geula, then using a non-Jewish name would postpone the Geula. And it definitely would be an Aveda to be ma'akev the Geula. That is an interesting way to see it, an interesting observation that we find in Shuvas Maharsham 100 years ago, 130 years ago. He was the Poisek Ador, Chelek Vav, Siman Yud. On the other hand, the Igros Moshe, Orach Chaim Chelek Dalet Siman, Samach Vav says, no problem at all. And the Igros Moshe quotes many Gedolim throughout the ages that used non-Jewish names. Most notably, Toises in Gittin Avches quotes Rabbeinu Peter. And those that even have a slight knowledge in history know that Peter is not a very Jewish name. He was one of the apostles of Oisei Ish, and one of the Bali Toises was Rabbeinu Peter, and he corresponded with Rabbeinu Tam. So Ramosha says, how could this be an Aveda? I just want to add to the list. The father of the Rameir Abulafia, who was one of the great Rishonim, his father's name was Todrus. That's a Roman name. The Maggid Mishnah's name was Vidal. That's a Spanish name. The Shara Melech, one of the greatest Achronim, was Nunis Bolimanti. Bolimanti obviously is an Italian family name, but Nunis is also not a Jewish name. Many of the Rishonim had non-Jewish names, so Ramosha argues it's not a problem at all, and he makes an interesting comment with which I disagree. And he says, the importance of Shelo Shinu as Shemam, Levusham, Velishonam is only up to Matan Torah. Because before we had mitzvahs, the only factor that gave a Jew his unique identity and separated him from his surroundings was external social effects. What language do you speak? What's your name? How do you dress? But after Matan Torah, what separates us and what puts us aside is Taryag mitzvahs. They have 7 and we have 613. That is enough to make us stand apart. Why do I disagree? Because there were so many Gzeres Chachamim that were exactly to set us apart and to separate us. We should not mingle with them. That is why they asad stam yenam. You can't drink their wine. That is why they asad pas akum. You can't eat their bread. Chacham asked the Jew to participate in a non-Jewish wedding. So obviously, in the eyes of Chazal, Taryag mitzvahs are not enough. And Chazal, with their ultimate wisdom and understanding of human nature, the mitzvahs you have are important. But we need some things on the social level. As people interacting with an alien society, this is about your social life and not about the mitzvahs. Yeah, you go to shul in the morning, you put on tefillin, you daven, you makayim shaliach haken, you say kriya shema shachar v'arves, Shabbos you have kedusha v'avdon. That is not enough. On the social level, so Chazal were metaken, you can't eat their bread, and you can't drink their wine, and you can't go to their simchas. So I do think Shelo Shinu is important throughout the ages, and not only for the Dor HaMidbar. But on the other hand, Ramesha argues so many Gedolim had non-Jewish names, and I want to add on not only B'yamei Rishonim, Amerom and Tanoim. One of the very first Zugos in the very beginning of the period of the great Tanoim Chachma Mishnah was Antigenos Ish Socho, mentioned in the beginning of Masechet Avos. One of the greatest and earliest Tanoim, Antigenos, is a Greek name. Rabbi Alexander is found both in Bavli and in Yerushalmi. And Alexander is a Greek name. One of the great Ameroim. Do you remember the halacha Moitzim Echaveri Olavarayim? Sumchus says, Momen Amut B'Sofek Chalkem. Sumchus is a Roman name. These were Tanoim and Ameroim. And they had non-Jewish names. The most disturbing name we find 3 times in Yerushalmi, Perek Gimel Masechet Brachos, Perek Ches Masechet Trumes, and in Masechet Nozia. 3 times in Yerushalmi we find Reb Titos, and that is disturbing because Titos is not only a Roman name, but it's a Gemara Mefareshes in Yom Daf Lamed Ches. You cannot give a name after an evil person, and very few people deserved that description and that title more than Titus, who destroyed the Beis Hamikdash. So how could you give Jewish people, Jewish children, a name Titus? Rabbi Yosef Engel in Gilyon HaShas in Masechet Brachos writes, no, this cannot be, and it needs to be Antigonos and not Titus. But it's very unlikely that 3 different sources in Yerushalmi, Antigonos became confused with Titus. If it would be one source, that would be reasonable, not if we find the 3 different sources. So, there are different versions in Yerushalmi. Tfus Venezia, Tfus Vilna, now we have Oiz Vahodor, and in some of them it is Titas without a Vav. Maybe it's a different name, Titas and Titos. Titus, I don't know. I don't know exactly how the Roman pronunciation of this name was. But another explanation would be probably Titus was a very common name under the Roman Empire, and maybe there were millions of people named Titus. One of them was an awful Russia, but maybe there were a zillion other Tituses who were decent, righteous people, and many Jews were called Titus, maybe even before Churban Beis Hamikdash. So no Jew gave a name after Titus HaRosh. And that brings me to an argument, against Reb Moshe. I think when a name becomes widely accepted b'kerev Beis Yisrael, it is no longer defined as a non-Jewish name. So there are different levels of Jewish names. There are names that we find in Torah, Nevi'im, V'Ksuvim. Those are the most beautiful names. Those are names that have profound remozim. Every letter has a numerical value, and every Jewish name has limitless interpretations and depth. But there are many Jewish names that aren't Hebrew names at all. My my late wife's name was Pesia. My mother's name was Fradl. These are definitely Jewish names, but they're not Hebrew names. So there would be no difference between Alexander and Fradl. Once Alexander is firmly established in the Jewish community, it ceases to be a non-Jewish name. I didn't do research, and I have no reason to do research, but I would just guess that more Jewish children are named Alexander maybe than Greek children. Alexander today is mamish Yiddish name. Alexander has morphed into Sender. Probably everybody listening to me knows one or two Senders. So Alexander would no longer be called and defined as a non-Jewish name, and maybe the same would go to Tudrus and to Vidal and many other, or Antigonos. Who knows? How could we know going back hundreds or thousands of years? Seder HaDoros is considered a very reliable historical source. And the Seder HaDoros, it's an encyclopedic structure. And on Shimon HaTzadik, he shares an amazing Mesoides that has no other source. So Masechet Yuma, we learn the story of Alexander the Great, who was one of the biggest conquerors in history. And the Gemara tells the story of Masechet Yuma. He wanted to conquer Yerushalayim and the Beis Hamikdash, and the Kutiyim, who were the arch rivals of the Prushim, of the Rabbonim, our predecessors. They cooperated with Alexander and urged him and encouraged him to fight the Jews. And he is marching towards Yerushalayim, sitting in his chariot, accompanied by the Kutim. And Shimon HaTzadik goes to be makabel upon him. And he's dressed up in bigdei kahuna of a Kohen Gadol. And the Gemara asks, what permission did he have to wear bigdei kahuna leaving Yerushalayim, leaving the Beis Hamikdash? And the Gemara says, Eis la'ases l'Shem eferus erosecha. I recently, about a few months ago, said a shir about the concept of Aveda Lishma, and I discussed this sugya at length, but it's not what we're talking about today. Alexander sees Shimon HaTzadik from the distance. He goes out of his chariot and he bows down, and the Kutim are furious. And they ask, what are you doing? We've come to fight these people. Why do you give them such tremendous honor? And Alexander says, whenever I am victorious in battle, I see the face of this person, and in his merit, I am victorious. This is my hero. That's the story as told in Babli Masechet Yuma. Now the Seder HaDoros writes, stage number 2 of this amazing story. Alexander agreed with Shimon HaTzadik to leave Yerushalayim at peace, but he has a condition. I want my statue placed in the Beis Hamikdash, because the Greeks were very much into art and into statues. And the statues of Alexander adorned many palaces, and he demanded, I want my bust, my statue in the Beis Hamikdash. Shimon HaTzadik apologized, and he says, it is impossible, in no way, because to us, that's a sin. Shimon HaTzadik suggested, in honor of Alexander, that every Jewish boy that will be born in the next year will be named Alexander. And that was a counter offer. And Alexander was happy, and that was their agreement. So tens of thousands of Jewish children were named after Alexander. And this story is troubling, because I said maybe there were 1 million Titoses. And if there was an Amoira named Titos, it wasn't after Titos HaRosha, it was after his grandfather, who was a big tzaddik, and his name was Titos as well. But according to Seder HaDoros, thousands of Jewish parents, fathers and mothers gave their name Alexander after Alexander the Great. I assume he was not one of the great tzaddikim. He was a conqueror. Tens of thousands of people died by his sword. For what? Just for power and for conquest? For what? So probably he was a Rosha. So how do we name Jewish children after a Rosha? So one must assume This too would be part of the Eis Lasos Hashem Eferos Dalasecho. Shimon HaTzadik needed to come up with some offer. What could we do in your honor? Putting a pesel into the Beis HaMikdash is a terrible transgression. So he suggested, yes, we will give your name. And that is Eis Lasos Hashem Eferos Dalasecho. So once again, is it legitimate to have non-Jewish names? Some Gedolim say no. The Moshe says yes. Throughout the ages, we find Tanoim, Ameroim, Gedolei Yisrael that had non-Jewish names. And whatever interpretation I might give would seem unlikely. The two most important sources are Tshuvas Marashdam. The Marashdam was one of the greatest poskim going back more than 500 years. Tshuvas Marashdam and Tshuvas Maharit Tzahalon. These are the two earliest sources, and therefore the most important sources. And their tshuvas were written to Jews that fled Spain. And they were written in the aftermath of the Inquisition. Not long ago, I visited Spain with a group of American Balabatim, and all the shiurim I gave were about that horrendous period of our history. So when the Spaniards and then the Portuguese a few years later decreed that Jews must convert to Christianity or leave the country, there were three different groups. Many Jews, lecher posenu, converted to Christianity, and they saw themselves as Christians. Hundreds of thousands left all their possessions, their homes, their monies, their parnassas, left everything behind, and they went into Golos. Tens of thousands converted lemar'it ayin, and they were called the Marranos. Marranos in Spanish is pigs. And b'chadrei chadorim, they continued to be devoted and dedicated in. So many of those that converted lefonim, and they just waited for an opportunity to leave Spain and to salvage some of their monies, most of them to salvage their families. So they converted lemar'it ayin, and then they asked these two gedolim, as we find in Tshuvas Maharashdam and Maharit Tzahalon. It is Tshuvas Maharashdam, Yoredei Semakuf Tzadik Tes, Maharit Tzahalon, Hachadosha is Chelek Beis Semakuf Nun Ches. And they asked the gedolim, we have acquaintances and partners that we deal with, and they know us by our Christian names. Are we allowed to use those names in our correspondence with them? And both the Marashdam and Maharit Tzahalon says, you have no problem at all using your non-Jewish names. And that goes contrary to the tshuva in Maharam Shik. My feeling is that this depends on the spirit of the times and the motive. Why do Jews want to use non-Jewish names? The Maharam Shik, as one of the greatest Talmidim of Sam Sofer, stood at the forefront of the struggle between the Orthodox and the Reformists and the Maskilim, the modern movements. And many Reform Jews of that period really changed their names because they wanted really to change their identity and move away from their Mesodas, from their tradition. And that was a huge struggle. And that is when the Gedolim of Hungary established the Orthodoxy. I think defining Frum Jews as Orthodox, that's the origin. That was the first time in history that Frum Jews, God-fearing Jews, Medaktikim Mitzvahs, defined themselves as Orthodox. So what the Maramshik was dealing with is Jews trying to veer away from their Messiah. And the reason they took non-Jewish names is because they really didn't like their Yiddishkeit and their being Jewish. And therefore the Maramshik and other Gedolim need to make a stand and a statement. In the days of the Marashdam and his predecessors 400 years earlier, those were Jews of Mesirus Nefesh. They left everything with tremendous Mesirus Nefesh. It was not that they didn't want to be Jews. It was just out of necessity, different time, different spirit, different circumstances, and therefore different halach. That is my feeling. Now I want to share with you an interesting observation about two great Gedolei Yisrael that had nothing to do with the Inquisition, and even in their tshuvas and their swarm, they use non-Jewish names, and that is somewhat surprising. So even if we say it's okay, it's mutar, but why would a Gedolei Yisrael use a non-Jewish name? And the two personalities I am referring to is Reb Taya Weil. He was a son of the Korban Nesanel, whose name was Reb Nesanel Weil, and his Jewish name was Yedidia Weil, but we have Shalosh Tshuvas Rabbi Tio Weil. So why would he use a non-Jewish name when he has a beautiful Jewish name? And the other is Rabbeinu Abdallah Somech, who was one of the great Sephardi Gedolim, and his sefer is called Zivchei Tzedek. He was the Rebbe of the Ben Ish Chai, of Rabbi Yosef Chaim of Baghdad, was his Talmud Muvak. And his name, as he signed his name, was Abdallah Somech. Why would he use a Muslim Arabic name? Until it dawned upon me. His name was Ovadia, and his name was Yedidia. And they were Choishesh of Moitzi Shem Shemayim Levatola. These two names include Shem Hashem, Ovadia and Yedidia. Me'ikar Adin, I don't think it's a problem at all. We all know about Rabbi Ovadia Yosef. He used the name Ovadia. One of my most precious Talmidim is his grandson, Adayin Amai Beis, Ovadia Yosef Toledano. I don't think it's a problem. I know some wonderful B'nai Torah called Yedidia, but they were Machmir. That is my feeling. And therefore, Theo is Elokus, is deity. Theology, theocracy. So Theo in Spanish is Elokus, and Phil is love. His name was Theophil, which means a lover of Hashem. That is the translation of Yedidia, Yedid Hashem. Abdallah is a Eved, the servant of Allah. So they preferred using the non-Jewish version of those very same names to steer clear from the chashash of Moitzi Shem Shemayim Levatola. That is my feeling. And I already mentioned the beginning of the Shir, the Tzafon Smoneach writes, when you use the non-Jewish version, which is only a translation of a beautiful Jewish name, that definitely is legitimate. So Theophil is the translation of Yedidia, and Abdallah is the exact translation of Ovadia, Oved Hashem, Eved Allah. And that is why these Gedolim preferred to use their non-Jewish name, and that is an interesting thought to think about. Now, saying what I just said, that it all depends on the motivation, the rationale, why would a Jew want to use a non-Jewish name? And that is the difference between the tshuvas of the Marashdam 500 years ago and the tshuvas of the Maramshik 150 years ago. So maybe when Chazal say, Shaloshinu es shamam et lishonam ve'et malbusham ve'et libusham, the Kpeda is only changing all the three. And that is exactly what was happening in the days of the Maramshik. They dressed like Goyim, they spoke like Goyim, They use non-Jewish names. That is an Isser. But so many of the wonderful people I know, the Bryans and the Michaels and the Ralphs and the Henrys, are the most beautiful Jews. Many of them wear their tzitzis outside, their tcheles, and their big black yarmulkes, and it's quite obvious where they stand. It's quite obvious how they behave and what they believe in, and therefore, for any reason, they want to use non-Jewish names because it's easier for their non-Jewish friends to pronounce. So how would a non-Jew pronounce, some complicated Jewish names like, I don't know, Mechche or Yechche or even Chaim? Some of them have difficulty with pronouncing a chet. And for any reason, if it's not about erasing your Jewish identity, then I think it would be totally legitimate. Like Rav Moshe Feinstein argues, and as we see in the most important two sources, which are the great Rishonim, the Marashdam and Maharit Tzahal. Having said whatever I said, I definitely think it's preferable to use your proper Jewish name. So the Chassam Sofer Ala Torah Pashas Korach has an interesting comment. The very first posik, Vayikach Korach. Rashi writes, Lokach mekach ro la'atzmo. And the Chassam Sofer says an interesting pshat. What was the mekach ro? His very name. Because Korach was one of Alufei Esav. And using a non-Jewish name has a bad influence on your neshama, on your kedusha. Bnei Yissaschar, Chodesh Nisan, has an interesting comment on this week's parsha. Mi'aldas u'ivrios, Shifra and Pu'ah, Rashi writes they were Miriam and Yocheved. So who gave them the names Shifra and Pu'ah? So the Bnei Yissaschar has an interesting comment, and he says, Pare probably had an advisor for Haredi affairs. Every politician has somebody that advises him about the Haredi mentality in Israel, and probably in New York as well. I knew one of the assistants of the governor of New York, who was a wonderful young Ben Torah. So Pare was told, as long as these midwives call themselves Miriam and Yocheved, it's a lost cause. They will never hurt a Jewish baby. Give them Egyptian names, and maybe somehow they will fulfill your wish and your command. And that's why Pare gave them Egyptian names, which are Shufra and Puah. So both the Chassam Sofer and the Bnei Yissaschar say, using a non-Jewish name would have some influence and would tarnish or diminish your kedusha. So even though al pi halacha it's mutar, and I would still argue both these sources deal with people who their ikar shem, their main name, the way they saw themselves and their families related to them was a non-Jewish name, which reflects a certain non-Jewish identity. Might be different, a person that is Chaim, and he's Rafon, and he's Baruch, and he's Mechoel, in his shul with his friends, in his family eyes with his children, when he's Oile LaTorah. For some reason, with some circles he interacts with, he prefers having a non-Jewish name. That probably would not be a kpeda. Nevertheless, the way I relate to my friends is with their Jewish names. That is the best way for us to relate to each other. Shem shenasnu lo avoisav, following in the tradition of thousands of years of Jewish names since the very earliest, Avraham Avinu, and from him on. So Baruch Hashem, the new Sefer, the new edition of Minchaso Shel Torah, which means so much to me in Baruch Hashem, what a schus. So, because not many people have the Sefer yet, I still take the liberty of sharing with you what's written in the Sefer. So what I said today is Siman Aleph in Minchas Oshach Shemois. And in this Siman there's a lengthy discussion, which we won't have time to discuss today. Well, Be'ez Hashem, we should have many wonderful opportunities in the future. But I also included in Siman Aleph Minchas Oshach Shemois. It's not in the old edition, but it is in the new one. Shalosh Shinu et Livusham. Because throughout the ages, in many places and in many times, there was a decree against Jewish garb. Started off in Russia, then it happened in Poland, and in other countries of Eastern Europe. Some Gedolim said, Yehereg v'al yavor. Most notably, the Vilna Gaon in Lithuania and the Chidush Harim in Poland. Others were lenient, and they paskined, go along. What I wrote in my sefer is somewhat of a compromise. And I wrote, if they want you to wear a strange non-Jewish hat, wear it. Non-Jewish shoes, wear it. As long as there is some siman heker in your levush. If your tzitzis are obvious, that is enough. And that still would be shalo shinus levusha. If you have any garment that shows your Jewish identity, you have a yarmulke on your head, that is enough. Shelo shinus levusha means if you entirely change your dress and a person looking at you would confuse you with a non-Jewish person, that would be the problem. And this is a halachic sentiment which is similar to what I did discuss at length in today's shiur about Shalishinu et Shema. So I find this a fascinating discussion. Yoisum Mamashe Korosi Lefanechem Kosuv Khan. And this siman in the new edition of Minchas Osher is a 10-page discussion, and I only shared with you part of it. So those of you that want to develop a deeper and broader understanding of this sugya, Minchas Osher, Madura, Tinyona, Siman Aleph. So in this week's parsha, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu asks Moshe Rabbeinu to be his shaliach and to turn to Bnei Yisrael b'Mitzrayim, Moshe is deterred. He tries to get out of it. And he says, I'll come to the Jewish people and they'll ask me, who is HaKadosh Baruch Hu? What's his name? What should I tell them? HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, Eheya asher eya. Koi soimer b'nei Yisrael eya shluchani aleichem. And this is one of the Shemus HaKadoshim that is found one time in the entire Tanakh. Torah, Nevi'im, V'Ksuvim. It is the only Shem that we find only once. What is the meaning of this Shem? Different interpretations. Rashi, Ramban al Torah, Rambam Moreh Nevuchim. Rashi actually defines Eya as a word. Eya imoim begolazu keshem she'eya imoim begolias acheris. I will be with them in this Golas, and I will be with them in all the future exiles. And Moshe Rabbeinu was shocked, and he says, why tell them that they're going to suffer again in the future? Isn't this enough pain? Why torment them and burden them with the knowledge that even after Geulas Mitzrayim, after the redemption, they will be going into Golas again? Why now? And HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, you're right. So use my shame only once. I will be with them, and I will bring them out of Mitzrayim, and they will be redeemed. That's Rashi. The Ramban brings an interpretation that it is midah keneged midah. I will be with them like they will be with me. And the Ramban also quotes the Rambam Moreh Nevuchim, which is a profound pshat. According to the Rambam, this Shem means I shall be, for I shall be. The most simple interpretation, translation of Eya Sharei, which means anything that exists in the cosmos and beyond exists because someone decided it should exist. It exists because someone decided there's a reason for it to be. There is only one thing that exists because it exists. Not because someone decided it should exist. It exists because it is inconceivable and impossible. It should not exist. And that is Kodesh Baruch Hu himself. Ehyeh asher ehyeh. I shall be, for I shall be. I shall be because I am. I shall be because it is impossible and inconceivable. I shall not be. And that is the message Kodesh Baruch Hu conveys to the people. You could rely on me. I am the only thing that shall ever be, that shall ever was, that could exist, whose word is 100% reliable and definitive. The Rashbam offers an amazing pshat. And for some reason, he codes it Beloshen Adbash, and he writes, Ein Megalan Ela Litznuim. I don't know what the Gevaldige secret is and why he saw it fitting to write and share this pshat in a code. But I'll share it with you because everybody could figure out Adbash. It's not that complicated. What the Rashbam says is, Ehyeh and Yihye are actually the same word. When a person speaks about himself, he says, Ani Ehyeh Sham, Ani Ehyeh Gadol, Ani Ehyeh Katan. When we speak about a third party, we say, Hu Yeh Sham, Hu Yeh Gadol, Hu Yeh Katan. So Ehyeh and Yeh are the same word. It depends whom are you referring to. And then the Rashbam says, Shem Havaya Yud Kei Vav Kei, Leosed Leva will be Yud Kei Yud Kei. And that is separate sugya. So Shem Ehyeh is Shem Havaya. It's the same. We call a Kodesh Baruch Hu Havaya. When a Kodesh Baruch Hu speaks about himself, he says, my name is Aleph Hey and Yud Hey. It is only once in history that anybody dared to ask a Kodesh Baruch Hu, what's your name? Whoever asked a Kodesh Baruch Hu, what's your name? It is only Moshe Rabbeinu in this week's Pasha that turns to a Kodesh Baruch Hu and asks, will you please tell me what's your name? And the Kodesh Baruch Hu says, Ehyeh asher ehyeh. And that is actually Shem Havaya. So according to the Rashbam, the message Kodesh Baruch Hu asks Moshe Rabbeinu to convey is a message of Rachamim. Shem Havaya, as we all know, is the manifestation of ultimate Rachamei Shemai. Elokim is din and Havaya is Rachamim. And the Kodesh Baruch Hu conveys the message, Kol di Oved Rachman al Atav Oved. I am with you in your pain, in your suffering, in your golus, and I will bring an end to it. And then HaKadosh Baruch Hu goes on to tell Moshe, Koi soim el b'nei Yisrael, Hashem Elokei Avosechem, Elokei Avraham, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yankov, Niru Elai, Zeh Shmi Li'olim v'zeh Zichri L'dor Yador. Koi soim L'ziknei Yisrael, Hashem Elokei Avosechem, Elokei Avraham, Elokei Yitzchak, Niru Elai, Leimor Poket Bekadet Yesrael V'sos Elechem Mitzrayim. Posik Tezvav and Tet Zayin. And there's a striking difference. Posik Tezvav, HaKadosh Baruch Hu miyached shemo al kol echad min ha'oves b'fnei atzmo. Elokei Avraham, Elokei Yitzchak v'Elokei Yankov. The next posik is Elokei Avraham, Yitzchak v'Yankov together. And why is that? Many years ago, I said a pshat b'derech remez. B'derech pshat. It's not really pshat. B'derech drush and b'derech remez. Chazal tell a story, an amazing story in Bava Metzia Pei. Eliyahu Novi used to come every day to the yeshiva of Rabbeinu HaKadosh to his koil to learn. One day he didn't show up. A day later, when he comes, the Rebbe asks him, where were you yesterday? I don't think any Rosh Yeshiva in the Yeshiva Gedolah today would dare to ask a bocher, where were you yesterday? Oh, he's going to get into trouble, that Rosh Yeshiva. The boy just will turn around and ignore him, and he won't talk to him the next 6 months. He won't come to his shiurim. That's the spirit of our times. Rabbeinu HaKadosh was a different type of Rosh Yeshiva. And he asks Eliyahu Novi, where were you yesterday? And Eliyahu has an alibi. He has an excuse. He says, well, I have a job up in the heavens. Every day in the morning I wake up Avraham Avinu. I do Netilas Yadayim. I wash his hands, Negel Vasa. I set him up to daven. When he finishes davening, I put him back to sleep. I wake up Yitzchak, Netilas Yadayim, Tefillah, and the same with Yankov. was a Rosh Chodesh yesterday. It's a long davening with Hallel and Kiyas HaTorah, so couldn't make it to the yeshiva. Rebbe is insistent, and he asked Eliyahu, why didn't you wake them all three up together, let them daven together, and you might make it in time to come to Koilel. And then Rebbe shares a secret. Eliyahu shares a secret with the Rebbe, and he says, I don't have permission to let the three of them daven together, because when they will daven together, Mashiach will come. And the time has not yet come. So I can't set them up to daven together. When they will, that'll bring the Geula. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't want to bring the Geula yet. So these two psukim, Posik Tezvov refers to the Geula Shlema, B'mehera v'yameinu zeh shmi le'olam v'zeh zichri l'dor dor. Regarding that Geula, it was Elokei Avraham l'chud, Elokei Yitzchak l'chud, and Elokei Yaakov, each of them separate. Because we're not there yet. Posek Tezayin is Poket Bekadat Yeschem v'sa'osi lachem b'Mitzrayim. Regarding this Geula, they daven together. And that is why Elokei Avraham, Yitzchak, v'Yaakov. So Kodesh Baruch Hu conveys to Moshe, this Geula is oisgepoilt, munach bekufse. The three of us daven together for Geulas Mitzrayim. And convey that message to Bnei Yisrael. You are redeemed. It'll take some time for the HBrachos, but be confident. You are a redeemed people. Elokei Avraham, Elokei Avraham, Yitzchak v'Yaakov convey this message. Pokut b'kadet yeschem v'sa'osi lachem b'Mitzrayim. I don't know where Eliyahu learns today, but I assume he still comes to the yeshiva. I don't think I saw him in my koilel. Wherever he learns, let us hope that Rosh Chodesh Shvat Tavshin Pei Gimel, he should be able to make it to the yeshiva. He should be able to make it to koilel. He should already be given permission to set the three of us up together. They should daven together and daven at once. And we should be zoicha to a geulas olam b'mehero v'yomeinu.